All right, chapter 14, part 3. We've all had dinner at my house here, and hopefully it'll be a little more calmer. So, we were talking about the Cold War, and just a refresher, this is the period of history roughly 1945 to 1991, which was a competition between the two remaining empires, the American and the Soviets, right? Communism versus the capitalism, if you want to look at it that way. And it ends in 1990 when the USSR collapses. So, let's look at this map. After World War II in Europe, we basically end with Eastern Europe and Russia, now the Soviet Union, being communist led. Allied also with the Communist Party in China, this is what they call the Communist Bloc. The other opposing part of the Cold War was NATO, which is the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, so England, France, this part, the free world is often called. So you had these two facing off against each other. And then the rest of the world was the so-called third world. These were the countries that weren't either all communist or all capitalist. They were kind of in the middle. And what happens is Eastern Europe are these independent countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania that become satellites of the Soviet Union. So they are not officially part of the Soviet Union, but they do what they're told. And so become part, in a sense, of the empire. Now, because the Soviet Union and the United States had so many nuclear weapons, direct war between the two was not even considered an option, so that we didn't destroy the planet. But that being said, there was still competition, and it occurred in the periphery between the two. So you have the Korean War, Vietnam War, wars in the Middle East, Africa, and Central America. And these were proxy wars where one side was supplied by the Soviet Union and China, and the other side was supplied by the United States and Europe. And so it was a way of fighting each other for control without actually going directly to war. Now, when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, leaving China as the only major communist power, so does all of that funding. And so Eastern Europe and all the proxy wars begin to fade away. And in fact, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself, the government collapses, and it breaks apart into Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and such. And so the Soviet Union is no more. And this is a great example of imperial overstretch. And what this says is that empires traditionally expand until they reach a point that they can no longer grow. They're going to grow as big as they can. They're not going to say, oh, what, I'm good. They're going to go until they can no longer maintain themselves. In other words, there are limits to empire. And so what are these limits? What stops expansion? The first one is information overload. The Soviet Union was 12 time zones wide and had a population where the majority of people were not Russian and languages from around the world. And this was a lot to control. A lot of these people that were in the Soviet Union who were not Russian did not want to be part of the Soviet Union. So it took a lot of control to keep them in check. And that's just a lot to manage, information overload. It's also very expensive. In the 1960s, Czechoslovakia, the leaders of Czechoslovakia decided they didn't want to be part of the Soviet Empire, and so they made movements and gestures that they were going to leave the communist world behind. And so the Soviet Union sent in its military, its tanks. But that is expensive to keep control, to pay for all of it. Okay? And then the last thing are strategic limits. So during the Cold War, the strategy of war between the United States and the Soviet Union was not direct confrontation because that would involve inevitably nuclear weapons, and there was a very strong fear that that would destroy the world. So the strategy was to push each other in those proxy conflicts, right? But what happens is sometimes those areas where they were fighting, they weren't able to reach a satisfactory conclusion. So, for instance, in the 1960s, we were involved in Vietnam, trying to keep Vietnam from going communist, but we were eventually thrown out and to become communist. But the Soviet Union tried to do the same thing in Afghanistan in 1979, and after 10 years and several 100,000 dead, they too left behind. And so what happens is all of these things can lead to what they call a legitimization crisis. So if you think about Iraq, right? We have been in two wars in Iraq. In the 1990s, when George Bush the first helped throw Saddam Hussein out of Iraq, and then as recently as the 2000s, when George Bush the second invaded Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein, right? And we were there, and a lot of people weren't happy with us being there the second time. And so during that next presidential election, that was one of the things that Barack Obama campaigned on, that we would get our troops out of Iraq because enough Americans felt that was beyond our reach. We didn't support it, that actually was part of the political landscape. So when empires disintegrate, when they begin to break apart, we call that decolonization, right? So they colonize, the opposite decolonization. And so this is when imperial forces either leave of their own will or they're forced out by an independence movement. So like we forced out the British in 1776, you could say. So it begins, the first major wave is in Asia right after World War II. Vietnam, Cambodia, these all become independent. India and Pakistan forced the British out in 1948. And by 1954, the Asian colonies were pretty much free. And then in Africa, beginning in the 1950s through 1975, we go from completely being colonized by Europe to not at all. One of the issues we've had, though, especially in Africa, as I'll show you in the next slide, is that those borders of the colonies remained, but there were conflicts with that. So remember when I said these borders, the white lines here, these were drawn by men in a conference room in Berlin? They didn't account for several facts on the ground. This is Nigeria right here. My cursor is. Let's zoom in. Nigeria and Cameroon. These little red and white areas here, the white lines are current national borders, but the red lines are ethnic groups. So this group right here, that lives right here, in 1, 2, 3 countries, is one ethnic group. They have a shared cultural area, but they were divided among 3 countries. So why was that? Well, the Europeans drew these lines. They were unaware, or more importantly, didn't care about that. So here you have a country where you have multiple ethnic groups, different cultures in the same country. Some are larger than others, and some are split across borders. And where does your loyalty lie then? So if you live here, right, does your loyalty lie to the government of this country or to your group? And so this leads to a lot of conflicts because a lot of these groups, sometimes there's also religious and linguistic differences besides the cultural ones. In Nigeria, there are several large groups, so much so that they've actually had several attempts where parts of the country have tried to break off from each other. So why don't they redraw the lines? Well, here's the thing. In Nigeria, the people who have the power today have the power over this entire country, not their group. So why would they want to give that up? What is in their interest to give power back to other people? They will hold on to it as long as they can. And so this leads to a lot of issues and a lot of instability in Africa. And there's been a long history of a lot of these former colonies being run by dictatorships or military governments. A great example right here is Sudan. So Sudan was the largest country in Africa. But right here is a boundary, and the southern half of Sudan is predominantly Christian. The northern half is Muslim. But when they drew up the colonial borders, the capital is in the north. The cultural group that ran the country was from the north. It was Muslim. And the people in the south were being discriminated against and had no voice. It took a civil war of 10 years or longer for it to finally be recognized that there should be 2 separate countries. Another example of decolonization is the Soviet Union. So remember, after World War II, Russia, or the Soviet Union, it conquered this half of Europe and all these countries, Germany, Poland, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia. These were all Soviet satellites, so not necessarily part of the Soviet Union, but they did what they were told. Okay, but what happens? As we mentioned, by the 1990s, the Soviet Union could no longer keep up with the United States. We were building more tanks, more rockets, more boats, and so were they, trying to outbid each other. And their economy wasn't as strong, and it begins to crack, and it begins to strain. And it cost a lot of money to keep troops in these countries, because that's the only way they were staying communist, was because the Soviet Union was basically paying it to do so. So what happens? There are uprisings in Germany in 1989. People are marching in East Germany. They want to be able to go to West Germany to visit their cousins, their family. It's the same country in many ways. They speak the same language, but they want to be able to travel freely, which they aren't allowed to do. The Soviet Union traditionally would step in with army tanks and jeeps and helicopters and put down those protests, but they couldn't afford to do it. They let it go, thinking maybe if we let off a little steam, it'll let go. And what happens is there are several uprisings. They see that the Germans are not being punished, so uprisings begin in Hungary and Romania, and these governments start making more moves towards acting independently. And eventually, in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. So the capital of Berlin, Germany, in East Germany, one half is communist, one half is free. There's a wall right through the middle of the city to stop people from fleeing the communist side to the east, to the democratic side. And part of the demands of the people in East Germany was to bring down that wall, to let us travel freely. And they finally tore it down, and the Soviet Union was not able to stop it. By this point, they could barely control their own country. And what happens is, once that happens in Europe, and the people who live in these countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Georgia, these were all countries that before World War II were independent. And they see that the Soviet Union is not stopping these countries. So they say, well, we don't want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore. And so they declare independence. And the Soviet Union tries to stop it. But by this point, their government's collapsing. And in fact, eventually, other republics, like the Belarus and Kazakhstan, and eventually even Russia, the Russian part of the Soviet Union, even they leave it. The Soviet Union basically dissolves by all the countries involved saying no more. And that had some unique, interesting things. New countries emerged. Kazakhstan had never been independent. Now it's one of the largest countries in Asia. Okay, and what's happening now is all that's left of the Soviet Union is Russia. So I'm going to pause right here. We're going to come back in just a moment with the next part, the Clash of Civilizations.